Probably 20 years ago, the whole kind of ethos of Silicon Valley was this kind of idea of don't be evil.
The way that wars are won are always through technology.
Being a warmonger in order to sell your wares, to sell your products is definitely not cool. We seem to have got ourselves in a situation now where we're in this AI arms race.
Still the same guys who are doing the transhumanism who are investing in all the military stuff.
We're in a kind of confrontation with China. We're in this kind of America first, very nationalistic, kind of almost semi-fascistic kind of political mood, and we just kind of embrace it. Yeah, these gamers who want to hook you up to the VR and they want to fight a war, and they've never fought a war. And it's actually Ukraine which has changed discussion about technology. It's all about selling people a technological idea that then desensitizes people to the reality of it, which you'll only sense when you're on the receiving end of it. A hopeful message is that it's not too late. We can stop this.
No, but don't just look at the hype, but really actually look at what the narrative is and who's funding those narratives.
Yeah, they want to sell you shiny stuff that looks amazing on YouTube, but it's going to end up killing you.
Really good episode on transhumanism last time, and we touched upon sort of AI in the military. And I'd like to sort of kind of talk a little bit more about the AI military complex and kind of what that means, what that is, what's happening in today's world with all this kind of stuff, and how these all things link together under the whole idea of this whole kind of Dark Enlightenment series and the tech barons and all that kind of stuff. So over to you.
Yeah, so we continue down our rabbit hole for this first season of the podcast of the Dark Enlightenment and looking at what the Silicon Valley tech barons are up to and into, and what the US government is doing as well. So we talked a little bit about AI and militarization and uses of AI for kind of nefarious ends, like the military complex and military conflict, right? And I think I'd like to start by first of all noting that probably 20 years ago, the whole kind of ethos of Silicon Valley was this kind of idea of don't be evil. So this kind of very bland, statement that Google had, and it was their mission statement was just kind of don't be evil, don't do bad stuff, guys. Whatever you do. I mean, we're not going to say exactly what it is, but don't be evil. Just be good. Don't do bad things. And I think that was quite strong in the culture at that time, and I think the Silicon Valley was identified to some extent with the Democrats. In California, still run by the Democrats, still strongly Democratic, and I think that it was identified with the Democrats. It was identified to some extent with what in the US they call liberalism, liberal values, which would be, in Europe, kind of more kind of centre left kind of values, and I think that's changed. I don't think they're afraid of doing evil anymore or being seen to do evil. And there's all these people now who've come out and who've just kind of embraced the kind of being in bed with the government and not being independent anymore, and kind of realizing that essentially we work for the government, and B, that the technology can be used for things like policing and military, and that's kind of okay. We just need to kind of embrace it. So I think that's what we should talk about a little bit in this episode, through some of these characters and through some of the developments that are happening.
Sure. So let's try and break down some of these key characters who are almost like avatars or NPCs in their own kind of right. One individual that comes to mind is Palmer Luckey, and a lot of things we're going to talk about touch home with me in a couple of ways, and I'll kind of explain why. The first one is obviously I'm quite an avid gamer. Right, so I've been there since the Xboxes, the PlayStations, whatever, early adopter and everything, including VR headsets where this particular individual comes into play. As we know, he was sort of like the founder of Oculus. He was developing, I think he was living in a trailer at the time, but which is quite ironic considering if you look at things like Ready Player One, where they're all in trailers wearing these kind of VR headsets. And he went on then to go and sell that company to Facebook for, I think, a couple of billion, basically. And he worked with them in a transitional period for a while. But once that lost his interest, and we've had this realm and this push and this hype of AI, there was this big mass where he could see how there was potentially a fight between now China and the US, and especially with places like Taiwan, which make probably about 90% of the semiconductors around the world for a lot of these kind of things. And he said, well, how are we going to win the war? Because they've got more foot soldiers, their military's bigger, they're better, socioeconomically they're becoming more powerful. So he said, right, I need to actually figure out a way to solve this solution. So he said, right, I'm going to invest my time and my efforts into artificial intelligence, with weaponry, with the military. I'm going to put my foot in that door. And he has, and he's being embraced by the same people who have bought his previous company, and other investors around him, as well as, you know, sort of like the Palantirs and things like that getting involved, which we know as well as kind of the Peter Thiel type thing. And he's quite a character, and obviously a warmonger, because that's how he's going to make his money. But the aspect, we know from past that the way that wars are won are always through technology, whether that's the invention of the bow and arrow, whether it's inclusion of gunpowder, things like that, whether it is the nuclear bomb being, you know, used well after the fact when the war was seemingly to be kind of finished already. And now we have AI, and we have drones, and we have a completely different playing field. And aside from the aspect of what happens with the kind of the casualties of war, it'd be quite interesting to see what your take is on why these tech barons, apart from their sort of slight emphasis on AI, are so massively sort of bankrolling or behind this AI for military.
Yeah, I mean, there's different aspects to it, isn't there? And, I mean, the first thing is being an arms dealer is not cool, or at least it wasn't, right? And you know, and being a warmonger, in order to sell your wares, to sell your products, is definitely not cool. And Palmer Luckey, that's clearly what he is, right? He's selling these products on a kind of startup model, but he's also trying to cause a war on some level. Yeah,
And diffuses it with a kind of floral Hawaiian shirt and some sandals. I don't know what that's all about.
Yeah, and the goatee beard.
Yeah, and a little soul patch, yeah.
Yeah, soul patch, is that what it's called? The palm tree shirt is actually an interesting one because it's actually, I think, a reference to this kind of movement, sub-movement of these people called Boogaloo Boys.
Okay.
And they were they were linked to the militia movement in the US, and particularly prominent around the time of the Black Lives Matters protests. And they were basically this kind of subgrouping of militias who believed that a US civil war was coming, and they somehow wanted to, kind of accelerate that. And they referred to because there was a kind of a level of kind of censorship on social media platforms at that time, they would refer to the Civil War as this electric boogaloo. Okay. And then they started wearing these palm tree shirts. Okay. So you'd see all these guys in, back then, kind of with assault rifles and these palm tree shirts, sometimes with, camo stuff on top or with bulletproof vests underneath. So it's definitely, in my view, it's definitely a reference to that. The gamer thing's really interesting because we've talked about it, before on this show a little bit. I think there's two things interesting. I mean, first of all, there's a dual use for gaming, and I think that's almost been from the beginning. That you can kind of train for military things in some way by playing video games. It's a bit like Flight Simulator.
It's immersion, yeah.
To train, to your reactions and to train to learn systems, right? So, Call of Duty, people obsessed with it, first-time shooters, training in groups. Back in the day, there was all this evidence that ISIS and Al-Qaeda was using Call of Duty and actually using it as a communications platform because the censorship and the CIA weren't trawling Call of Duty real-time conversations.
I imagine
and so on.
I imagine it's probably a bit of a propaganda tool as well, because a lot of those Call of Duties were very specific to certain cultures who were the enemy as well. So, it's retraining that kind of mindset. And we've seen it outside of Call of Duty with things like games like Gran Turismo, like racing games, where they've held competitions and that person's actually gone on to become like a serious driver,
So it's also training the population in certain values, right?
Yeah.
So especially the first-person shooter.
It's a desensitization as well, isn't it?
Yeah. I remember I was in Brazil about maybe 15 years ago in a place up the coast, a small town up the coast from Rio, and I had to go in and check my email. And back in the day, they had these cyber cafes, and I was actually the only person checking my email. The entire place was full of these young Brazilian kids all playing first-person shooters like Half-Life, and in a place as violent as Brazil, yeah, it was quite shocking. It was just these people just killing and
It's like
killing.
a gun range, isn't it?
They
Really,
were just really good at killing you in these games. So there's definitely a sense of desensitizing people. You know, all the stuff around what's it called, Grand Theft Auto, and kind of how brings a certain type of sensibility. And there's been direct crossovers, for instance, with helicopter pilots, video games, and so on. Right, so there's that kind of dual use, and I think through the VR. Palmer Luckey was very attuned to that and the gamers, right? And then the second thing about the gamers, and we talked about this in a different episode, was this kind of around the Gamergate incident, was this idea of the gamers being almost like a kind of shock troop for these kind of anti-politics, kind of populists, these kind of disenfranchised young men, essentially. So we talked about it in the Incels episode of these kind of gamers being these kind of just, disengaged, people who are only kind of engaged through the video game, and you can kind of bring them in as a kind of angry mob at certain times. So I think there's that element. And I think Palmer Luckey, in a way, encapsulates both those things, right? This kind of idea of the tech just being, great, let's kill you, let's just, it's just fantastic. You can get these drones to go and kill people. And then also this kind of idea also of the white male who's kind of disenfranchised, who relates to society through video games. And I'm not definitely not saying that everyone who plays video games is like that, because I know you're not, and I play video games as well. And I'm not saying everyone's like that, but there's that element. And then I think the final thing, which is really important here, is this idea of lack of empathy, because ultimately you're talking about stoking up a conflict with China, a nuclear-armed nation with one of the most powerful militaries in the world, systemic rival to the US. I mean, really, is that really what you want? Is a war with China? Is that a good thing? But for him, it is. He's quite gung ho about it, and that to me speaks to a kind of lack of empathy, right? Because any war between modern powers today just will involve millions of deaths and people getting maimed and just all kinds of horrors that we haven't even seen yet. So, the idea of kind of somehow stoking that up or accelerating it in order to sell your products for me is a particularly repugnant idea.
But it's also going back to like what you mentioned on one of the other episodes, which is like, it's happening more and more. When we touched upon sort of medievalism and those kind of things. And we got like Palantir and stuff. The Peter Thiel, who's like a major investor in Anduril, and you know more about this than me because I know you're a massive Lord of the Rings fan. But the name in Anduril as well, the idea of this kind of forging of this sword to cast away darkness, where it seems that Palmer Luckey's trying to sort of bring in the darkness.
Yeah, well, we talked in the Lord of the Rings episode around this idea of one of the things that's attractive about the Lord of the Rings to the kind of alt-right is that it very much deals in kind of binary values. So that, the people on the other side are essentially just completely evil, and it's okay to kill them because you're talking about absolutely good versus evil. And I think the embracing of that through these kind of fantasy names, Anduril and Palantir, it's a way of kind of reclaiming that and saying we are absolutely able to use these weapons against evil, and then of course the other side is absolutely evil. Whether that's 1.4 billion Chinese people or whoever it is, they're just evil. We just need to compete and get out there and make sure we win. Right, and that's what this is all about. And then to a certain extent, I think this moment, what it reflects is anxiety in the US about China, right?
Yes, 100%.
In particular, but not just China, but China's kind of the focal point for anxiety. I think about their own sense of decline, which again we've touched upon in other episodes. It's kind of ironic. I mean, the US economy has been doing fairly well over the last decade compared to other economies, but they are convinced that it's been a decade of decline, that they're losing out, and you see that across all the US debates. And there's something real to it, which is that in manufacturing terms, China is, for me, a long way ahead now in terms of the ability to do high quality manufacturing at a great scale, right? And so this kind of comes together in this kind of sense that. And we'll talk a little bit about this book by Alexander Karp called The Technological Republic. It's this kind of idea that we've gone soft. Silicon Valley was really only concerned about consumer products and about the internet and kind of soft stuff, media, social media. And we need to be making real stuff that's going to give us power, right? So it's partly about that as well.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things, what you touched upon. I think, in the last sort of 20 years, we've seen sort of the US especially become more sort of insular. The whole manufacturing element has kind of completely disappeared. We know that, we're talking about how Palmer Luckey talks about this idea of this war over Taiwan between the US and China, but there's also this kind of realization now that for a lot of the guidance missiles and all that kind of stuff that they've been making in the US, a lot of those semiconductor chips are coming out of China. So now they're trying to bring that back into the US, but they don't have necessarily the infrastructure. And besides the infrastructure, they can't build that stuff at the same price point that the Chinese can. So despite the fact that they may have a similar unit which may cost 10 or 100 times more than what maybe the Chinese can make, you're talking about the difference between one killer bee versus a swarm of them, and a degree of these operating on hive mentality. We only have to look at the last time China hosted the Olympics, and we saw that wonderful display of all the drones. Imagine that coming at you in the trenches. You can't bat away all those things. And I think that anxiety level of the US is, I think they're trying to reach out for a war in terms of not necessarily sort of like the physical state, but in terms of superpower, something that they've already kind of lost in both terminology of like manufacturing, socioeconomics, stuff like that. They've kind of feel that they've left everything too late. So that's why it's kind of like, okay, this ties back into some other things as well, which will take off on a slight tangent, and then we'll get onto this kind of thing about the book, which is this idea of where so we've got this big advent of this kind of AI military stuff going forward now with Anduril, and we've got like kind of the old yesteryear ideas of the military power, like the Lockheed Martins and the Boeings and stuff like that, and then we have also these kind of they used to get a lot of funding from the government, but now we've seen with these kind of new AI revelations that they're being self-funded or being funded by these tech barons. And I don't know if it's kind of related, but obviously we've known, I've touched upon this before, and I love the idea of UFOs and all this kind of stuff, but we've seen these ideas of these UFOs or UAPs in American airspace, which has gone to Congress. And it's like, this is our new big threat now. So when a threat is pushed forward, then the right rises and says, right, we need to invest in that. And it almost feels like maybe this is actually a cash grab from all those old Lockheed Martins and those Boeings, because they're losing a lot of these. They're going to be losing a lot of these contracts to people like Anduril and things like that, because you don't need tankers anymore.
Yeah, a lot of people are going to make a lot of money out of this, and already are, right? And Trump, just a few weeks before we recorded this podcast, they passed the big beautiful bill in Congress. It's one of the biggest ramp ups of funding for the military in history, right? As well as actually for immigration enforcement and policing against the US population.
And in tandem, they've done a little bit of enforcement on the UK side in terms of military as well.
So and they've been pushing everybody else to up their percentage of GDP to spend on military. So, to take a step back, the first thing to think about, right, and I think it's so important to slow down the conversation and just think about what we're doing here. The first thing is that this is an absolute waste of human resources. Absolute waste. We could be doing clean energy. We could be industrializing we could be focusing on education for the US population. We could be focusing on healthcare for the millions of US citizens that don't get decent healthcare. Hundreds of millions of US citizens don't get decent healthcare. So there's so much more we could be doing. We could see China and US cooperating to stop climate change and investing in high-tech manufacturing to do renewable energy equipment. There's many, many things we could be doing. And instead of that, we seem to have got ourselves in a situation now where we're in this AI arms race. And some of these people very self-conscious about it. And what they do is they go to Congress all the time now and they say, essentially, if we don't do this, then the Chinese will do it. And so we need to be investing in these enormous data centers, this whole kind of big compute model of AI, large language models. And it's a way of making money for these people, right? And it's a way of making money for certain people in the energy industry, people in the chips industry. And unfortunately, many people in the US have allowed themselves to go through this pathway where instead of engaging with other powers like China so that nobody has to be spending on military, they've essentially promoted an arms race. And it's quite interesting. They were around the AI hype. Alex Karp, who we'll talk about in a minute around this book, he was at Davos, I think, and he was essentially gave this kind of whole kind of very self-satisfied spiel. And he said the AI industry is essentially American AI. He said it's just American AI. All the technologies are in America. All the people are in America. You know, this is an American industry. It's an American AI, right? This kind of nationalistic idea of AI. And then literally a couple of weeks later, the Chinese came out with a DeepSeek model, and it was kind of, in my view, it was kind of like state trolling at a very high level, where the Chinese just said, actually, we could do this with a bunch of laptops, you know, whatever the truth behind it. And then all the big tech shares and a lot of energy shares crashed, you know, when they did that. And I'm sure they can do it again. But the dynamic is not good. I mean, it's essentially about saying that we need to invest massively in AI, massively in data centers. Doesn't matter the environmental impact or the human impact, because we need to be in this arms race. And there's a kind of real side to that to some degree, which we can talk about in terms of things like autonomous weapon systems, drones, targeting, and so on.
I mean, so, yeah, I mean, the contradictions are rife, and it's like, I mean, obviously, you know, we both have backgrounds in renewables, you more so than me, and it's like, you know, when they hold these things like, you know, the COP talks, and they have like their greenwashing, they're talking about what they're going to be trying to do with climate change, but they're investing massively in these data centers or creating more wars, which are counterproductive to the environment, to climate change. You know, it's like, you know, the left hand's doing one thing, the right hand's doing another. You know, it's a shame it's not more transparent, that people don't realise this is, like you say, it's a money game, and it always has been.
Yeah, of course, war's a money game.
Yeah.
There's always been the merchants of death, who are the,
Blow it
you know,
up
the
and
arms
build it up with your
manufacturers,
guys,
the mercenaries, the condottieri, you know, and the people who make money out of war. And then there's the vast majority of people who suffer from war, not just from the actual conflict itself, but also from disease and shortage of food and water and all these other things. The civilian population, which essentially will suffer. Right?
Well, that also ties like back into the last episode on transhumanism, in terms of like, you know, as humans and as progress going forward, we should be looking at some way of trying to better ourselves in some sort of way. But it's never discussed that, you know, maybe transhumanism or things like that will bring peace and all this kind of stuff. It's still the same guys who are doing the transhumanism who are investing in all the military stuff, you know, and it categorically makes no sense other than it being a money grab. And we've seen recently as well, you know, people like Spotify investing into AI, military, all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, but this is the thing. I mean, this thing about don't be evil, and you know, all these people, they presented themselves as being good people in some way, right? Even Mark Zuckerberg, these people, even Elon to a certain extent, and now essentially they've gone for this kind of rush of the US politics has gone this way. We're in a kind of confrontation with China. We're in this kind of America first, very nationalistic, kind of almost semi-fascistic kind of political mood, and we're just going to embrace it, and we're just going to say we're going to be your people for making sure we win against someone else. So just this embrace of nationalism. And you mentioned the transhumanist thing. You remember in a previous episode we talked about our dear friend Mr. Feridun M. Esfandiari, the Iranian
the alphanumeric guy,
basketball player, wrestler, and you know, futurist, who renamed himself as FM 2030. One of the things that I found funny when I was researching that episode was he refused to answer any questions about where he was from, because he said we're all basically all human, and you know, he was anti-nationalist, and he said there's no illegal immigrants, there's only irrelevant borders. He kind of had this idea of this kind of global uplifting of humanity. I mean, we can disagree with a lot of what he said, but he basically said that, you know, that's those things about kind of nationalism, rooting yourself in some kind of identity against somebody else, you know, that's all holding people back, right? So even those transhumanists, you know, they had a more positive vision of the future than these guys. I mean, these guys, they you know, these gamers who want to hook you up to the VR and they want to fight a war, and they've never fought a war. And I think there's a generational thing here as well. So, you know, our parents and their parents remembered having fought in world wars, right? And as a result of that, they had this deep historical memory of it. It's a horrible thing. These people don't have that at all. And their only reference to war is gaming, right? And it's shooting digital avatars.
I mean, one of the things I'd like to mention, which I sort of very recent, it was concerning the Ukraine war and drones. And we talk about gamifying stuff. There is actually a point system, so that they're bringing it across in that way as well. So you get this other sense of reward. So you're not actually killing people; you're just gaining points on the leaderboard.
Yeah, I think that's always been a thing in war as well, right? War is about young men to a great
Sort of
extent as well.
medals, yeah.
Jousting, medieval tourneys and tournaments, right? I mean, that was all part of the preparation for war as well. And in many situations, war is a kind of game. There's some good books about this actually, about war as game and war games, right? And war gaming is the way that militaries prepare with red team and blue team, right? It's also how you prepare with cyber attacks and things like that. So they've kind of this gamification has always been part of war, but I agree with you. It's also about dehumanizing and kind of somehow making it acceptable. And it's interesting you mentioned Ukraine, because I think that even though the US focus is around China, it's actually Ukraine which has changed discussion about technology in war, right, over the last 10 years,
and Palestine
right?
stuff,
And Israel and
yeah.
Palestine as well. And we could maybe go to that after. But in Ukraine, this the drone war is now a reality, right? And with the drone war 20 years ago was about these kind of big predator drones. You remember they started to operate in Iraq and the Middle East. The Obama administration used them a lot in Afghanistan, Western Pakistan, to essentially go and assassinate people, take out targets a long way away. They were managed by operators remotely, right, from these facilities in the US. And that now has gone to discussions around kind of drone swarms, smaller scale drones, but on a much larger, in much larger numbers, as you mentioned, right? So this whole idea of the unstoppable drone swarm, but then also how do you control those drones? And again, it's gone through things like having an aerial show. I've been to a couple of these recently, actually. They're even more amazing now than they were back then at the Beijing Olympics. Being able to control through algorithms the behavior of large swarms of drones, right? So that we're through that. And then the whole counter-drone discussion about how do you take drones down. So all that is now being tested in the battlefield, and has been for the last 4 or 5 years in Ukraine. And that's allowed people to actually see in a much more granular way what a modern war will look like, right? And does look like. And it's about who can produce very large amounts of drones, who can control them, who can push through the spoofing and the counter-drone electronic warfare. So you see at the moment they're using fiber optics in Ukraine, but that is not a long-term solution, right? Because it's limited eventually in terms of the range and so on, right?
I mean, it was quite interesting in this TED talk with Palmer Luck in terms of what he was suggesting or trying to sell his wares, so to speak, because there was this argument, as you suggested, that a lot of these drones were remotely operated, but he says, in the battlefield, you can't have a one-to-one, one person just manning one drone. It's just that the scale is kind of ridiculous. And he says, even if you were able to commit to something like that, and he was obviously still using China as a reference other than anywhere else, because that's his big end game, because it's one superpower versus another. His whole remit was like, well, all they'll simply do is they'll put up jamming frequencies and our drones will fly out of the sky. And that's where my software comes in. Now, we're a hardware company, but we're a software company at the forefront of stuff.
This is actually what the Ukrainians are doing right now as well. Right?
And it would literally will be like, right, if they put those jamming signals, our hands go up, and then the AI will decide who should and should not be killed. And also in the Ukrainian thing, like you mentioned, and sort of like it used to... actually, it was in Israel where they used to use these. They still use these kind of systems to go through that determines how many civilians may be in a building in terms of who may need to die, and according to if there's Hamas or something in there. And it used to go through, allegedly, through a series of generals or something to say, okay, yeah, we can go after that building now. But because of the response times that they claim that they need, all that paperwork is just getting pushed to the side, which is why we're seeing.
So targeting
genocide.
systems and classification systems, which is one of the kind of main uses for AI, right? Is classification of things, people, objects, and so on, right? So these kind of automated systems where they're essentially running spreadsheets and going, if X individual is present at a site, then we can kill these many civilians. Linking also different data sets, so we know that this person has a family member who frequents X place. They have a company that's linked to X place, so then therefore they're most likely to be in this place at a certain time, and therefore we can target that building with some chance that they will be there at that time. and so on, right? So they start making these kind of moral decisions at the same time because, as you said, you need to be able to make those decisions for them very quickly because they want to kill as many of the enemy as they can. Right?
And they use previous US wars as justifications, whether it's Vietnam, whether it's Iraq and stuff like that, and they show the measures of civilians that were killed against militants basically, and say, well, the numbers here were like this, so we're going to be a bit more fine-tuned. And one of the things that I don't really want to keep saying his name so much, but one of the reasons Palmer was trying to sort of justify this stuff, as I mentioned off camera before, when he was talking about the autonomy and stuff of military weapons, and he says, we've got things like mines which people step on. He goes, but a mine can't differentiate between a tank and a school bus, whereas my AI will. But again, they're speaking from the voice of potential victors, where, well, look, this is going to save lives because it's going to be less people coming back in body bags to the US. But on the flip side of it, it basically means there's going to be three times the amount of people killed on that side. And it's going back also as well to the kind of Call of Duty thing. Sort of, we're seeing, okay, maybe the wars won't all be won with drones because someone will come up with these, as you say, the anti-drone technology to wipe out all the stuff with like these fiber optic stuff that the kind of Russians doing at the moment. So then the next stage is foot soldiers. So, are they going to then endorse these Tesla robots with soldiers sitting at home with like Oculus VR headsets playing Call of Duty, but it's actually real live action?
Yeah, I mean, we know that's what they'll do.
And Boston Dynamics dogs running down the street with,
Yeah, and we know that's what they'll do, and they're already trying to do it, and the Chinese are also doing it on their own right. I saw a Chinese military exercise the other day where they landed the troops in some aerial vehicles. They jumped out with all their goggles and stuff on. There was a bunch of robot dogs alongside them with machine guns, and they went up ahead of the soldiers. I mean, we know that's what's going to happen, right? All of this stuff is about preparing the way for that to happen, right? And we've got to be clear about this on this podcast. All this stuff, the science fiction references, the kind of language of the products and the objects that these people create. You've got to watch Palmer Luckey's videos on YouTube. It's all kind of very slick. It's all about entertainment. He's taken the lessons from gaming. Right? It's all about selling people a technological idea that then desensitizes people to the reality of it, which you'll only sense when you're on the receiving end of it, right? So it's really important to push. If there's one thing people need to push back on is this ridiculous kind of dystopian language of objects that they sell to people as kind of attractive objects, and that's one thing that Silicon Valley has done better than probably any industry in history. So you remember we talked about Elon Musk's robots, and there was a time when he was promoting it. It was kind of fake because they were being controlled by operators. But there was one advert in particular, I think we mentioned, where Cybertruck pulls up. There's a robot inside.
Cowboy hat, wasn't it? Or was that a different one?
No, there's another robot with a cowboy hat and a Tommy gun, old-fashioned Tommy gun. Opens up on the Cybertruck, breaks the glass and stuff, but it doesn't kind of penetrate the protection. And then the other robot gets out and says, "I'm still alive," and it's like ha 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 ha. But the next thing you'll be on the streets of Los Angeles, and that will be law enforcement, and it's not that far away, right? And you won't be able to argue with it. And you may have been targeted because of the color of your skin or the likelihood of you committing some crime through some corrupted database that you've been fed into, and then it's not funny anymore.
No, I think it's one of the things I mentioned before as well. Like, obviously, living in the UK, especially places like London, which is one of the most surveilled cities in the world, and they've been using a lot of this face recognition software, which is very biased, especially against people of colour, and it can't really actually tell the difference. But you're getting people sort of arrested on the streets as such. But one of the other big questions that's being asked, which is kind of obviously throws some of this AI stuff into doubt as well. But one of the other big questions that's being asked is like, what if this whole dystopia of AI and where it's going isn't hype, and we're creating these army of Tesla robots and drones, and suddenly they're like, actually, what the fuck are we doing? It's time to go back after the humans type thing. So you're creating these big workforces. What if at that point artificial intelligence does actually become, I don't want to use the word conscious, but actually, does become intelligent to that remit and saying, actually, we're destroying ourselves, and these people, this planet will be better off without us type thing, Are these guys actually taking any of that into consideration? Or they don't have to worry because they're going to be transhuman gods?
Yeah, exactly. They're going to be transhuman gods, or they think they're programming at a higher level than the rest of us, right? Because they've got more control
Yeah.
and more agency than the rest of us. And we've made this point a little bit in previous episodes, and it's a point that Bruno Maçães, the Portuguese philosopher, makes, where he says, "I'm not worried so much about the AI. I'm worried about who's behind the AI." And he uses this quote from June, where he says that it's about who controls the intelligent machines. And I kind of tend that way a little bit. They're preparing the way for a system, and that system I think will be controlled by a few people. It won't be controlled by us. And I think what's interesting is that it's always preparing the way for the next step. So, this thing around Palmer Luckey and autonomy. So the drones can get spoofed or taken down by electronic warfare. You can try having fiber optic cables as they are doing it in the Ukraine at the moment, but there's real massive limitations to that, right? So then the next step is, as Palmer Luckey says, the drone needs to be able to make autonomous decisions. If it's getting attacked through electronic warfare, and that's the conclusion the Ukrainians have come to as well. So they're deploying autonomous drones now. Same with your roadside explosives, so you can have a kind of intelligent IED. Blow the right people's legs off rather than the wrong people's legs off. And all of this, it has a kind of logic to it, right? Because but then what's the end result of this is you've given autonomy to these devices. And that is an incredibly dangerous thing to do. And it's really interesting. If you go back and read the literature of 20 years ago, there was very strong pushback in the UN and in international forums, including from some of these countries, of saying the one thing we must not do is allow the weapon systems to actually make decisions. So we can have drones that are controlled by people, but the kill decision has to be made by people. And that was a very strong pushback. Most countries, there was attempts to have strong international treaties around this. And you had the tech companies essentially saying we're not going to get involved in surveillance and political military stuff. And now they're all like, yeah, bring it on.
I mean, the other thing that we haven't sort of kind of really touched on, there are, I've been sort of, just for like episodes like this, tampering with some AI things to see whether these things are real and what they're capable of. And there's a program that I'm using at the moment, just seeing what it can do, which I won't mention because I don't want to give it too many props. But the idea is it's kind of like, it says it's using AI, but it's based upon the large language models. Okay, so it's utilizing that. But it's almost like a self-healing technology. So whatever I'm creating when it throws up an error, and I just get these red patches all over the screen, it just kind of sits there and thinks the job's done. And then suddenly it will say, oh, no, sorry, I need to rewrite that code. So what's to stop, the idea of Tesla AI robots or Anduril robots or whatever out in the battlefield saying, okay, because tactically they're going to have to become more aware and better to circumvent enemy drones. So they're going to have to be in a situation where they start rewriting their own code on the fly, which is then going to open up a bag of worms in terms of them having errors, reprogramming themselves, going over, rewriting over the what was it? The 4 laws. Or was it the 4 laws?
4 laws of robotics.
Yeah, so you've got this kind of thing where it's then, people sort of determine, say, well, that must be consciousness then, because it's rewriting its script and stuff like that. But there will be a point where it will try to self-heal or self-code. What happens when a drone gets shot down and it realizes that one of its propellers is gone? It's going to have to sort of reevaluate so it can go back up in the air, rewrite code to kind of get around that. It's not going to be able to be reliant on human resources because it's going to be behind enemy lines. So, and the idea is we're constantly looking to pump things into it, because I don't see, from a technological point of view, and I could be wrong, and tell me if I'm wrong, how we've got this small group in Silicon Valley doing what they're doing, and then we've got this big Chinese infrastructure here who's at the forefront of technology in terms of development and all those kind of things that actually have their own stuff. How this is even going to compete?
Yeah, well, they're trying. I mean, they're trying, right? And they're trying to reindustrialize, and they try to restrict the chip supply to China, through the chip wars and Biden's plan, the Chip Act, and they're very conscious of the fact they need to industrialize. In fact, one of the latest Peter Thiel investments in this company called Hadrian, which is about high-tech manufacturing and trying to get US military manufacturing kind of a higher technological level because it's so low level compared to China. So, they'll try. I think just by the nature of it, China has a bigger industrial complex, and not just for weapons, for everything. And that just means bigger clusters of all the supply chain that you need to build anything. That's why iPhone is in China, right? And that's why most US high-tech products are in China, because you've got that availability of skilled engineering talent, and you've got supply chain everywhere, right?
Yeah, it's also that kind of thing though that it's also for propaganda reasons. But the US are very vocal about kind of what they're doing and what they're trying to achieve with AI and military stuff like that, whereas China don't seem to be. But they're obviously onto something. Like you mentioned before, it's like, okay, here's our deep seek. You didn't know we were kind of doing that. So what else are they doing?
Yeah.
They don't feel the need to tell everybody what they're doing. They just don't need to. So
No,
we don't know
although-
their level of advancement, or do we?
No, although to be honest, I mean they are scaring people as well. I mean, if you go on socials, you will see the Chinese robot dogs. I mean, one recent one I saw, it was like a drone mothership, and it was like this really amazing video of this kind of AI video of this. It was like a huge airplane, and eventually it comes along and then it just opens up and then it's like thousands and thousands of drones come out. And it was like everyone was sharing this video and going like, whoa. And then a few weeks later, they literally, one of the Western companies was like, one of the Western aerospace companies was saying, yeah, we're going to build one of these. And that's kind of the logic of it, right? It's partly talking about it, it's partly bluff. You're right. I mean, I agree with you, the Chinese are less boastful than the Americans, and they're more austere in their communications.
Yeah.
But they're definitely out there with their tech. And it's not always military tech, it's just tech in general. They're very good at doing things.
I mean, that's one thing I wanted to point on, is that when we talk about things like the military aspect and weaponization, we think of drones, we think of AK-47s, tanks, big naval ships. But there's the other flip side to AI, which isn't quite often talked about. I mean, we see the differences between the Chinese TikTok and the Western TikTok and stuff like that. And now we're seeing this advent of AI or replica females that are trying to do, where you've seen like people marrying their sort of AIs recently and stuff like that, and are able to, these AIs have full conversations, are able to manipulate the individuals they're speaking to because the AI knows them more than others. Maybe that's even the kind of warfare that we should be more worried about, in terms of like these replica conversational models getting into the home and basically dumbing down a population. Because they're happy with their little AI partner in the corner, so there's no soldiers to fight the war. There's no one to manufacture these goods, because they're living a different life in wherever it may be. So I think there's kind of different aspects and different levels to it, and maybe I'm thinking with this. I'm not a boomer, and I don't you're a boomer, but maybe thinking with this kind of idea of like that's how war is, because we saw the change actually in war with the whole kind of ISIS stuff as well. It wasn't big armies going; it was individuals strapped up with bombs coming in. Doing things in different ways.
But it was also social media and scaring people and kind of introducing new level of barbarity to kind of intimidate people as well, right?
Which is what we said was like Elon pointed out before in a previous, not our podcast, but in previous podcasts, we were saying the memes are the new nuclear bombs.
Yeah. I definitely think that we haven't seen any of that yet. We've really seen just the tip of the iceberg. If there was a war today, I think they would unleash massive cyber attacks, right? And again, behind the scenes, they're testing each other all the time. And obviously, because everything is now controlled, in clouds and through IT, everything from electricity to hospitals and administration systems that we just rely on for our basic kind of well-being, functioning, banking systems. So there'll be massive cyber attacks for sure, and there'll also be attacks of what you might call cognitive warfare, which is just kind of creating noise and information
it's that FUD, isn't it? That fear, uncertainty, and doubt.
So like in Ukraine, they were targeting the Russians were targeting people's mobile phones of people who'd just been called up to phone their family members and say that they were being sent to an area where they would be killed or they could get wounded.
The deep fakes episode where
and then finally, to go to the deep fakes, I don't think they've unleashed that yet, but they can. And then you will literally see party political broadcasts, you'll see fake information, you'll see politicians come out telling us to do things, you'll see loved ones telling you to do things. Well, that whole thing, I bet you, I would be very, very, I would bet any amount of money, that they have that all prepared and ready
Oh yeah,
to go.
of course. I mean, I've seen like old footage of sort of Zelensky and like these big green rooms where they're taking digitizations of his face and stuff like that. And it's kind of like, you know, it's almost getting to a stage now where wars can't be lost, or coups cannot take effect, because the first thing you do is you go in and you control the media, you control the narrative,
Yeah.
right?
And you can keep people fighting for a long time beyond which they normally would do.
Exactly. If a leader's been assassinated, well, we've got his digital version. We can just keep this going for as long as we want, until we kind of just completely, just blaze something to the ground, so that we can come back with our construction companies and build it back up and again. But it's also I think for a lot of people, the idea of guns, drones, military dogs is a lot more scary than manipulation of the mind, because that's the war that we've known since humans began, basically.
Well, people definitely don't like the robot dogs.
Oh no.
And they've tried them in certain places in California, and people immediately get very cross about it. And the Chinese, funnily enough, they are using them, and I think because there's a higher level of social cohesion in China and surveillance, that people are kind of accepting them more there. But in general, people don't like the idea that there's a non-human technology that can essentially mess you up,
I
and that you can't necessarily reason with.
I think there's a psychological ploy there as well. I mean, obviously, in especially heavily in the West, we've domesticated the dog, and it's one of the few species that has kind of evolved, to be beside us type thing. And then you've got this kind of idea that you're taking that domestication away, and there's this kind of, you've got this robotic sort of thing. And like in the law of writing, when you're like want to create, the easiest way to create an antagonist is have them hurt an animal, kick a dog, something like that. So if you take something which is beloved, and then suddenly, it can be the enemy, it gets kind of scary. And especially when you see these things move, like the speeds of like cheetahs or leopards. And I remember when I first saw it was back in the days, I think even when Bin Laden was still alive, and it was just after they were first doing these kind of tests, and I was like, right, this is what we're going to send in now. We don't send soldiers, we're going to send this in, and basically it's going to have like a bayonet on the front, and it's just going to chase after ISIS people and just run into them. That was the whole idea. It's like it does 60 miles an hour, and they showed it on like kind of these treadmills doing this kind of stuff. But the fact now that in such a short period of time, these things are patrolling the streets, and
But that's the thing. I mean, you continually prepare people for the unacceptable.
Yeah.
Right? And the reason people find robots creepy, or many people find robots creepy, is because for that same reason, right? That we're used to communicating with people in a certain way, which is partly verbal, but is also kind of instinctual. It's through eye movement. It's through kind of more kind of intuitive communication. And then suddenly you've got this thing that's controlled by an alien intelligence, or by someone else, or by an algorithm.
But it's also, people forget how often when you're using your computer with a Windows, Android, or Mac, how often you see the spinning ball, or how often you get a crash, and that's based upon an operating system. Now, predominantly, these devices are working on, I would imagine, a completely separate operating system to avoid being hacked. But they're going to have that spinning beach ball at some stage. They're going to go into what we call a kernel panic, where they get stuck into a loop. So if there's an error code where it decides to attack one person, that goes into a kernel loop. It's just going to keep doing the same thing.
Yeah, it doesn't. I mean, it doesn't sound great, does it, Simon? I mean, it's and again, I mean, it's about it's about pushing the boundaries all the time, and sort of saying, well, there's a reason why people push back about the idea that robots could autonomously take decisions about whether to kill or not.
But then it's also going to get down to the idea of like that whole idea of the US with its kind of First Amendment, the kind of right to bear guns and stuff like that. They're probably going to be far off of the right to bear, a military grade dog
robot
to counteract. Robot dog to counteract, whatever the US have put out on the streets in the next sort of 20 years, because I need to protect my home from people. And then it's like, then where does I had this when I was caught speeding once, let's just say, and I had to do one of these kind of advanced driving courses, right? And I wasn't doing anything way, but anyway, I was caught, and I did this thing. So my question to them was like, well, they said something quite ridiculous, like, oh, well, just keep the car in third gear. And I was like, well, the cars we're driving, if it's in third gear, we can still go quite fast. And I said, well, what's the premise if, say, for example, you're driving sort of like a Tesla? Can't do it so much in this country because you can't run the full autopilot. But suppose that machine then doesn't register quickly enough that the speed limit's changed, and it continues, and you get a ticket, right? You haven't been touching the wheel, right? who's responsible to pay that ticket? And they said, well, it would still be you because it's your vehicle. And my argument was, well, yeah, but the car's driving itself.
That's the legal,
So
regulatory minefield that self-driving cars are in, right?
Yeah, so then what I'm trying to say now is if you take that theory and you apply it to somebody's own military robot dog they've got in their house, which they may have hacked or reprogrammed to be more aggressive, like we see people doing it with certain types of breeders of dogs in the UK, automatically, train them to be a bit more fierce, and it could be like, right, I want this to attack, any black people come in or any females that come in, and then you can just say, wasn't me, it was a malfunction with the dog. It's like, this goes back to what you were talking about with these kind of laws that they're sort of trying to bring in to protect the rights, because fundamentally that robot dog would now be protected with those new digital rights.
Yeah, but you know what? They've got plenty of lawyers in the US. And but there's plenty of work for them with this stuff.
But that's the other thing as well. There's this whole idea that lawyers will soon be wiped out by AI in itself, because it's a routine job that just is based on an old archaic language that, in theory, these large language models will now be able to understand.
I mean, a hopeful message here, I think, is that a hopeful message is that it's not too late.
I don't think
we can stop this, we do need to stop this, and we do need to wake up.
Yeah.
And don't treat it just as a joke all the time. And
No.
we shouldn't let people like Palmer Luckey with his palm tree shirt and his little, what did you call it?
Who, by the way, looks like that character from Toy Story.
He does look like the character from Toy Story. We should not allow these people to have too much power or make too much money, and we should be definitely calling them out for what they are, which is warmongers and people who are trying to make a buck out of death and suffering, right? So I want to be, a little bit serious about it, because it's like, we don't just need to hurtle down this path, right? And we talked in other episodes about science fiction and how it starts off as being kind of a warning, but then we end up doing it anyway. So dystopia kind of ends up being a kind of roadmap for us. And there's something in us, I think, that is impressed by the tech and the shininess and the products, and it's part of our human curiosity as well. Of kind of, I wonder where it's all going to end up.
It's living through that different time and that different age as well. But I think it's also, we have to, with the AI, we talked a lot about it being a hype machine, and I think we need to de-hype the hype, because if it isn't as advanced as they claim it to be in Silicon Valley, that this thing is almost, in a couple of years, it's going to be consciousness, it's making decisions that, trillion times a second that we couldn't even make. If it isn't as good as what they're saying it is, and you have people like Palmer Luckey putting that technology into these drones, which in a sense would be a flawed technology, then that's not good.
No. But what's it doing, though? It's running spreadsheets in a very fast, automated way about it's failing very fast to succeed, about what to hit and what not to hit, right? And that we've seen that in the targeting systems. We've seen that in how they're running a lot of weapon systems, and then it's also kind of using pattern recognition in different ways through training models, right? And one of the things which is interesting, I mean, the whole self-driving thing. So the model around using AI to analyze video footage, which is the model Tesla's been trying to use, still doesn't work, right? And there's been very high fatalities, accidents. You've seen the footage of like the cars just taking off suddenly with people inside and just going off and ploughing through people. It's pretty scary, right? What was that? There's one in China where it just takes off and it just. And I'm not saying it can't be solved, but right now they haven't solved it. And then, in fact, the models that were working better are actually using LiDAR, which is just kind of a radar to detect objects, right? Which seems to me like a sensible technology to stop accidents, right? But what I'm saying is, no, we're definitely not there yet, and we're definitely not there in letting the spreadsheets decide who lives and dies, because as you've mentioned, a lot of it reflects just bias in society of who should be killed and who shouldn't be killed, and it's a terrible idea to just run people's lives through these spreadsheets and then hand that kind of autonomy over to weapon systems as well. So all this stuff, Silicon Valley knew 20 years ago it was wrong, and that fundamentally it would lead to evil outcomes. And I think we need to get back to talking about that. And do we want this?
I think there's two things. One thing I was trying to remember when you was talking about sort of like these cars having accidents was, one, I was trying to remember that film with what's his name, the Marshall guy. I think it had like Julia Roberts or something. It was a Sandra Bullock.
Oh, I know the
Where
one.
it's taken
Yeah.
over and all the Teslas just start smashing into the back of each other. But I think the one thing that I would definitely say to the audience, because also we're trying to play sort of, we do a lot of research, we're also trying to play a bit of a devil's advocate here and be a kind of tool to people out there as well. I think it's really important that people don't just look at the hype, but really actually look at what the narrative is and who's funding those narratives. And I think they'll get a better idea of what's going on. Because even when these things go off and they may kill, you know, one big militant leader and then 500 people have been killed, at the end of it, whoever's behind it, those governments will create a narrative to justify those 500 civilian deaths for that one. So we just need to be on it and look at more than just one source for information. And not everybody on YouTube is an expert, including us. So use the research there.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, do your research, but also, you know, peace. You know, like let's
Never trust
yeah,
anybody.
like we can't just go down this kind of, you know, headlong path towards war, and that's what these people want. Yeah,
Yeah.
they want to sell you shiny stuff that looks amazing on YouTube.
Yeah.
But it's going to end up killing you.
Yeah.
Right. So, you know, and we've seen this at other times in history,
Yeah.
and you know, so like, you know, you got. It's really important people put their thinking brains on and start thinking, hang on, where is all this going, right? And not just let a bunch of salespeople kind of push you down this road,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah. So it's about, it's categorically not about getting like the whole hippie thing and the tie dyes out and all that kind of stuff. But actually, we need to think about, as you're saying, Ben, is maybe constructing certain bodies to try and, you know, what's quite alarming. Sort of finish up is just like we look at these things as groups or large corporations, but they're ultimately single individuals. With a
Yeah,
lot
it's
of
people. It's
power.
people doing this, and it's people writing the
Egos,
books, and people making the arguments, and people, you know, designing the products, and it's people creating narratives around
And
those
they own,
products
and
and
they own
selling
the
them.
they own the narratives. They own the social media platforms. They own the newspapers. They own the TV stations.
As we've seen throughout the series, it's the same, often the same people who sit in
Yeah.
these ecosystems and are pushing the same ideas, and it's a very dark and dystopian path that they are treading.
Yeah.
And they would like us to tread that path with them
Yeah.
and be inside their narrative bubbles, right? But you know,
It's not going to happen.
guys, you know, let's create our own narratives here, and for God's
Yeah.
sake, not be trapped in these dystopian narratives that these people are pushing, because it really will be the end of us. So, don't want to be too dramatic, but you know, we need to push back against you know, this idea of the technological military complex.
Brilliant. Cheers, Ben. And like always, guys, please like, subscribe to the channel. It does help. This is the first in the series. We're going to be doing some more series, and we're going to get some interviewees on hopefully fairly soon. So please like and subscribe, and see you on the next episode.